Comparing China and liberal democracies from a regime perspective. My name is Erik Cornelis Hendriks. I'm originally from Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and currently I'm a postdoc in sociology at Peking University. And I'm also an alumnus of the University of Chicago, and therefore the University of Chicago Center was so kind as to allow us to use this room. In this presentation, I will first briefly summarize, introduce a new social theory, my regime theory, which I've developed together with a Swedish co-author. And then in the second part, I will apply this new theory to the comparison of the Chinese regime and Western liberal democratic regimes. And thirdly, I will comment on what I believe are the strengths of this perspective I'm proposing. So our new regime theory. First of all, when I use the word regime, I'm talking of it in a neutral sense. So quite often, when you come across the word regime, especially in the media, it will carry a negative connotation. I'm using it in a neutral sense. We believe that every society has a regime, and there is a variety of regime types, one of which is a liberal democracy. Now, this first part may be a bit demanding, especially for those who don't have a background in social theory. But I assure you, bear with me, because when I apply my theoretical framework to China, it's going to get a lot more concrete. So, our new theoretical framework draws on a synthesis of Greek political philosophy and contemporary social science, particularly the field theory of Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. Our new theoretical framework is structuralist. We look at the fundamental power structure of society. We look at long-term historical developments. We believe that every society has a holistic character, and regime thinking is always comparative. That is, if you want to understand any regime, you have to compare it to other types of regimes. So I'm currently writing a book about this topic with my Swedish co-author Jens Mikael Klinteskog. He is a freelance journalist and human rights lawyer. He speaks fluent Chinese and Arabic, and he lived in both Egypt and Syria during the revolutions. In Syria, he was supporting the moderate rebels, and at some point he was arrested by the Syrian government, spent a few weeks in a Syrian prison, after which he was kicked out of the country. And then he came to China, and that's where I met him. And we decided to team up because we believe we truly complement each other. My background is in academia and social theory, and he's coming at this from the real world. And I think this is important because regime differences are very worldly issues. This is a very worldly topic. This is not something you can comprehend if you just sit in a library. So in our book, in our upcoming book, we have a number of case studies on theocracies in the Middle East. We compare democracy in the United States and Scandinavia, and we have a chapter on China. So regime thinking derives from ancient Greece. The Greeks called it politeia. Politeia, or regime, was the central concept of Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Politics, and also features prominently in the histories by the Greek historian Thucydides. In that sense, regime is the oldest and original concept of the social sciences. Aristotle famously distinguished a number of regime types: democracy, oligarchy, aristocracy, monarchy, tyranny. Now, for the modern reader, it's important to understand that when the ancient Greeks wrote about regime, they didn't mean political system. They meant the holistic character of society. So they were not comparing the political systems of different societies, they were comparing the holistic structure, the holistic character of different societies. For the ancient Greeks, regime was as much a cultural, social, and economic category as it was a political category. Second, regime for the ancient Greeks dwells on all levels, from the macro to the micro level. So they're not just talking about macro level institutions and power relations. Regime also dwells in the values, habits, the style of life of the people. So when the Greeks compared democratic Athens, militaristic Sparta, mercantile Corinth, they did not truly distinguish between critically analyzing the institutions in these societies and the character of the human type that these societies, these regimes tended to produce. So Aristotle defines regime, politeia, in the following way. He says, a regime is the arrangement of society's parts, in particular that of its most powerful part. So what the most powerful part is differs depending on the regime. So in Athens, it could be the democratic assembly. In Sparta, it would be the military. And if you would apply this perspective to our contemporary world, perhaps in the US, the contemporary US, it would be the business field. And in Islamic theocracies, Iran or Saudi Arabia, it would perhaps be the religious field, the clerical elite. Aristotle also says that regime is a certain ordering of the inhabitants of the polis, the city-state, the form of the compound, and the way of life of the citizens. Regime thinking has been influential in the West all the way up to the French Revolution and the works of Tocqueville. In fact, the modern word regime, what the Greeks called politeia, refers to the French Revolution, in which the ancien regime of the French king and the Catholic clergy was overthrown in a paradigmatic modern regime change that gave rise to a republican nation-state and a new kind of citizen. However, regime thinking in the ancient Greek spirit is fully absent from the modern social sciences. It disappeared in the 19th and 20th century. And there are a number, and when political scientists nowadays compare political regimes, they're talking about something completely different. They're not speaking in a holistic Greek sense. So there are a number of reasons why regime thinking disappeared. The rise of a number of rival perspectives. First of all, the rise of Marxism and historicism, other types of historicism, which de-emphasized regime differences since they prioritized world historical stages. The rise of functionalism in the 20th century, which de-emphasized power relations. And finally, academic specialization in the social sciences. The rise of sociology, economics, anthropology, and political science as separate academic disciplines. The contemporary social scientist has difficulties thinking big picture because she carves up society into a number of what I would call artificial abstract divisions. Into the political, the social, the cultural, and the economic. Now, in all kinds of applied case studies, social scientists will constantly discover interconnections between these. They will study political phenomena and then discover that they're interacting with the social structure. They will study social structure and discover that what they're studying interacts with culture. And then they study culture and they realize it interacts with the economy, and the economy influences politics, etc. But in making all these supposedly spectacular discoveries, the contemporary social scientists rarely step back to realize that all these discoveries are only that it was they, the social scientists, who carved up society into these abstract categories in the first place. So I compare this to someone who hides their own Easter eggs and is then triumphantly finds them. We want to revive the ancient Greek spirit of regime thinking in the contemporary social sciences. Our sociologized regime definition is the following. Regime denotes the way in which social fields, their prestige systems, logics, and conceptions of human accomplishment are differentiated from each other and hierarchized. Regime differences between societies then are differences in the hierarchization of social fields and the degree and manner in which fields are differentiated from each other. So what are these social fields? I'm speaking of fields such as business, politics, science, philosophy, journalism, art, the legal field, the military, the religious clergy. Here I'm drawing on Bourdieu's field theory. For Bourdieu, fields are little microcosms in society. Each field, to some extent, carries its own rules of the game, its own internal social hierarchy, its own principles of social distinction. Now, traditionally, Bourdieusian scholars always visualize a field as a square, and the gray square would be the field. The white dots would be people, would be players in the field. So this could perhaps be the journalistic field, or it could be the religious field, or the scientific field. So the players at the top, they have a lot of capital. That is, they have a lot of prestige within the field in which they're operating. Whereas the ones at the bottom have very little capital. Now, the ones on the left, that are more towards the left, those players are more purely playing according to the field's autonomous prestige system. Whereas the players on the right are more influenced by outside forces. And for Bourdieu, that would always be economics and politics. So imagine you're a journalist, let's say in the United States. If you're all the way on the left, on the autonomous edge of the field, then you are an investigative journalist who is writing, hoping to win a Pulitzer Prize. But if you're on the right side, you are likely to be more commercial in orientation. Let's say if you're the Rupert Murdoch kind of journalist. Because Rupert Murdoch, of course, head of Fox and Fox News, is perhaps more of a businessman and also has a political agenda. Within every field, you have a competition between the more autonomous players and more heteronymous players, a struggle over the principles guiding the field. The autonomous players have a strategic advantage in bolstering the autonomous prestige game on which their status purely depends. Whereas the heteronymous players, because they're operating in the field using political connections and money, for instance, outside forms of capital, they benefit from a more heteronymous field. That is less, heteronymous would mean less autonomous. So the heteronymous players profit from a less autonomous field, a field that is less differentiated from its social surroundings. Now, Bourdieu's second central concept is habitus. He says that your position in the field also determines your habitus, which are your attitudes, your tastes, and your habits. So the players with more capital tend to have more upper class attitudes, tastes, and habits. With less capital, they have more lower class attitudes, tastes, and habits. And then you also have a more autonomous and more heteronymous habitus. Now, what is so innovative about Bourdieu's theorizing? First of all, he builds a meso-level bridge between the micro and the macro. So this was one of the central problems of social theory. How do you connect the general macro-level power structure of society and micro-agency, people's subject experience, people's subjective tastes? How do you connect these two levels? And Bourdieu does so by placing by the concept of fields and habitus, which are meso-level concepts. The second theoretical innovation is that Bourdieu is capable of conceptualizing pluralism within the system. He is able to conceptualize the fact that a society can have a general overall power structure, yet also pluralism and pockets of resistance. Bourdieu is working within the Marxist tradition, and the Marxists, they struggled with this. They couldn't conceptualize pluralism. They had a notion of the system, the capitalist system. This was the overall power structure. The whole world turned capitalist, and people's minds are completely drenched in capitalist ideology. But if you have such a total capitalist system, how could it be that some people are more capitalist than others? How could it be that some societies are more capitalist than other societies? How could you even, as a Marxist critic, how could you even criticize capitalism? Shouldn't your mind also be drenched with capitalist ideology? Where does this resistance, this possibility of resistance even come from? So Bourdieu, he never faces these difficulties, because his notion of fields introduce pluralism within the system. So fields are little pockets of resistance. And to the degree that fields are autonomous, they are independent of the general power structure. But at the same time, there is truly one overall power structure in society. Because all fields across society try to uphold their autonomy, fighting against the same set of outside forces. Now, there are also a number of weaknesses in Bourdieu's field theory. First of all, it's not comparative. He mostly studied France, and he doesn't have a systematic framework for comparing radically different societies. Second, Bourdieu always assumed that business and politics were working in a perfect, impenetrable alliance. This is a very problematic assumption, but it derives from Marxism, of course. This is the capitalist alliance. But as a Chinese person, you must certainly be aware that politics and business can conflict, or can obviously conflict heavily, and that there can be all kinds of tensions between business priorities and political priorities. The last weakness in Bourdieu's theory is that he doesn't make a distinction between politics and state bureaucracy. Whereas in fact, in a lot of societies around the world, these are differentiated fields. In fact, there are some societies in which the state bureaucracy is arguably the leading field in society and more powerful than politics. That would be in Scandinavia, where the state bureaucracy is both very independent from politics, and where the state bureaucratic elite is arguably much more powerful than the political elite. So I'm going to rewire Bourdieu. First, to say any field can be the master field. Any field can be the most powerful field in society. So in a theocracy, The master field can be religion. It doesn't have to be business or politics. Religion can also be a dominant field in society that influences other fields. In a dictatorship, it could be the military field. Then I say that any field can influence any other field. So politics and business can also be influenced from the outside. And for instance, religion could influence politics in an Islamic theocracy. Then, of course, there is real-life tension between the political field and the business field. And it should be obvious to anyone in this room, given the fact that there has been massive tension between these two fields in the past 70 years of Chinese history. Then I want to coin the term, I want to introduce the concept of regime habitus. Bourdieu only has a concept of class habitus. But of course, regime habitus is not entirely new. In fact, it is a return to the original Greek thinking. When the ancient Greeks didn't use the word habitus, obviously, because it's a Latin word, but they had a notion of it. When they analyzed the differences between the typical Athenian democrat and the mercantile Corinthian and the militaristic Spartan curriculum, in a theocracy, theology, religion, is likely to play a central role in the university. So the universities are not automatically and by necessity the domain of science. So the institutional infrastructure, schools, universities, media institutions, churches, temples, courts, ministries, all this forms a landscape over which the different fields are competing. Now, it seems as if I'm changing Bourdieu in many different ways, but in fact I'm just doing one thing. I'm lifting Bourdieu out of the Marxist tradition and placing him in to the classical tradition of political philosophy. Classical Greek regime thinking, its strengths was that it built a macro-micro bridge and that it had a comparative angle. But the Greeks could never conceptualize pluralism within the system. How could you have one regime, yet some people are not as much in the regime as others? How could you have resistance to the regime within the regime? So Bourdieu, he is able to conceptualize pluralism within the system, but he doesn't have a systematic comparative framework for comparing radically different societies. So by synthesizing these in our new synthesized regime theory, I'm trying to bring together two very powerful theoretical frameworks. In my new field conception, fields have an autonomous, at the core, they have an autonomous prestige system, their own social hierarchy, their own value system and principles, and conception of human accomplishment, a specific conception of human accomplishment. Yet fields are never fully autonomous. They're always being attacked, heteronomized by outside forces. Yet some of these outside forces are more powerful than others. And this reflects the general power relations shaping the regime. So let's say this field would be the American journalistic field. Then that big blue arrow would certainly be business. But if this were the journalistic field in North Korea, insofar as there is a journalistic field in North Korea, that blue arrow would certainly be politics. So then, the regime manifests itself in the outside forces that shape each semi-autonomous field across society. So I realize that this was a lot of information and that this may all sound very complicated. But actually, our new regime theory is very simple in a way. Because when you apply our theory and you're trying to understand the fundamental character and power structure of a society, you only have to look at two variables. The first is, what fields are there? This leads to the question of social differentiation. Is religion separate from politics? is business separate from politics? To what extent? Do you have a journalistic field? Has philosophy differentiated from theology? Then the second variable is the power relations between the fields. How are the fields hierarchized? And the principles upon which fields are hierarchized in society are especially determined by the principles of the dominant field in society. So this then leads us to understand the holistic character of society on the macro, meso, and micro level. So on the macro level, you would have the power relations between social fields. On the meso level, whenever you study a particular field, you can see the regime manifesting itself in terms of which outside forces vie, skew the would-be autonomous status game. And then on the micro level, on the level of habitus, a more field-differentiated society is going to have more differentiated social roles. And in addition, the most powerful field determines what is the most powerful human, the predominant and dominant human type in society. So when we look at our contemporary world, in the Middle East we would have Islamic theocracies, countries such as Saudi Arabia and Iran, but you could also think of IS. They would be marked by low field differentiation. The leading field would be religion, and it would be productive of the theocratic human being. Liberal democracies would be marked by a high field differentiation. Though what the leading field is can differ. I would argue that in the United States it would be business, and that the American regime is productive of the economic, democratic human. Whereas on the other extreme of the democratic spectrum, Scandinavia, in the Scandinavian regimes, the state bureaucracy is the leading field in society, and these regimes are productive of the bureaucratic, democratic human. In China, finally, is also marked by relatively low field differentiation, the lead of politics, and productive of what I call the harmonious human being. So let's apply our new theory to the China case. The Chinese regime is marked relative to Western liberal democracies by relatively low field diversity, that is, great field unity. And the political field, as the most powerful field in society, is a great unifying force. Politics heteronomizes fields all across Chinese society. Journalism, from journalism and science to the religion and the economy. My favorite example is from religion, is that the Chinese state is bent on selecting the Tibetan babies that are deemed the real reincarnation of deceased Buddhist lamas. That is a very direct interference in the would-be prestige game of Buddhism and the religious field. But even the Chinese economy, though it has grown greatly more differentiated from politics over the last 40 years, is still, in comparison to Western liberal democracies, less differentiated from politics. You can see this, for instance, in the fact that if you're a businessman in China, having a great political network and political capital is truly beneficial to your business career. That said, over the last 30, 40 years, China has become greatly more field diverse. Ever since Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up, field diversity has been growing exponentially. I shouldn't say exponentially, but it has greatly increased. That is, in the past, China used to be much more field unitary than it is today. And if you take this into consideration, then you can truly grasp just how fundamental Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up really was, because it breaks with hundreds, if not thousands of years of Chinese history. China has a very long history of field unity. Through the total politics of Maoist China to the imperial era, in which the central field of the scholar official dominated society to such an extent that it significantly decreased social differentiation. The scholar official, the field of the scholar official, the central field, was so, was such a heteronymizing force because the scholar official was supposed to exemplify human excellence in all its forms. So the scholar official was an official bureaucrat / politician / artist / scholar philosopher / businessman sometimes / sometimes even military commander. Now, compare this to ancient Athens. Probably the first truly field-diverse society in human history. There you had the philosophers, the democratic politicians, the poets, the artists, the military commanders, the merchants. These fields were to a very large extent independent from each other, differentiated. That meant that if you were a philosopher in ancient Athens, you may not have any political influence or any political capital. If you are high up in the political hierarchy, it didn't mean that you had any philosophical prestige. You could be a famous poet and not have any prestige in the philosophical field and vice versa. That meant that these social hierarchies, these fields, these social roles were to a large extent differentiated from each other. So in field-diverse societies, you can play different social roles, but then you're always operating in different fields. So you could perhaps be a philosopher and an artist, or a philosopher and a politician. That's fine, but then you're playing two different roles. Whereas in a more field-unitary society, these roles are not differentiated, and you play them all at once. There was a great renaissance of field diversity in early modern Europe, starting in Renaissance Italy, moving to the 17th century Dutch Republic, and then to France and Britain. Politics and business differentiated. You had the rise of finance and journalism. Philosophy differentiated out of theology. And out of philosophy arose experimental science. Professional art differentiated out of religious art, and you had the rise of literature. So in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, when the European colonial powers were in contact and interacting with Imperial China, they were forming two very different types of entities. Sorry. Oh, could you get me a tea, actually? So, by the way, sorry I'm making all human societies look like bacteria under a microscope. So on the left side, you would have tribes. Tribes are field unitary. You have only one hierarchy. At the top sits the tribal leader. Even if there are competing factions, the two factions will have political or personal disagreements, but they will not be coming at each other with completely different value systems. But tribes are tiny. Then early modern European nation states are these field diverse entities. China is extremely field unitary regime, Imperial China. Yet on a massive geographical scale. First, the Chinese empire was gigantic. Second, it had an enormous centralized bureaucratic machinery. Imperial China was this unitary, self-contained rock, whereas the European nation-states were much more porous and open. In these European nation-states, you had all these rival elites competing against each other, and it gave society an open character, because all these elites had an interest in reaching out to make foreign alliances. So the different religious authorities, based on their denomination, would create foreign alliances in their competition against secular businessmen, secular philosophers, and politicians. Meanwhile, the philosophers of, let's say, Britain and the Dutch Republic would form strategic alliances. Merchants, the bourgeois merchants also had their transnational networks. But in imperial China, where you have one field completely dominating society to a very large extent, if you're a player in this field, what you need to do to further your career is play according to the internal rules of this field. It doesn't help you to reach out to create foreign alliances with, let's say, British philosophers, or to buy British industrial technology, or to make an alliance, strategic alliance with the clerical elite of some foreign religion. No, if you are in a scholar official in the central field of China, you can compete against other scholar officials, but it's never beneficial to reach out to the outside world. It doesn't give you any strategic benefit. Sorry. So this is the real secret reason why East Asian societies and China have historically been so closed off from the rest of the world. It's not because East Asians happen to be more conservative in spirit. It was because of the unitary social structure. This then also manifests in the Chinese regime habitus, and I'm talking in very general terms, including also, to some extent, contemporary Chinese people. It would translate on the level of habitus into an appreciation of harmony rather than an appreciation of tolerance, a respect for authority rather than an anti-authoritarian spirit, and an insider-outsider epistemology rather than perspectivism. So first, harmony versus tolerance. These are opposite virtues. Harmony is the virtue of a field unitary society. Tolerance is the virtue of a field pluralistic, field diverse society. You should recognize what tolerance actually is, because it sounds so nice. But tolerance presupposes irreconcilable disagreement and a lack of respect. If you respect someone, you don't have to tolerate that person. If someone has a different perspective from yours, but on some level it is still reconcilable to some extent, you don't need to tolerate that perspective. So, in the 17th century, my native city of Amsterdam was actually known as the city of tolerance, because it was a big mess. You had the religious authorities who were trying to turn Amsterdam into the New Jerusalem. Then you had these secular merchants who were turning it into a commercial center. And then you had philosophers such as Spinoza and also at some point John Locke, who were walking around trying to turn the city into a center of the Enlightenment, or what later came to be known as the Enlightenment. So, in fact, when foreigners visited Amsterdam in the 17th century, they usually didn't like what they saw. They were shocked by the religious tolerance for Jews and other strange religious groups. And they were shocked by the free and egalitarian spirit of the people. That leads me to the second point, respect for authority versus anti-authoritarianism. In a field unitary society, you are confronted with a rather uncontested order. Whereas in a field diverse society, you're confronted with all these rival authorities. Now, I like to use the image of the parent. If you have a father and a mother and a child, and mommy and daddy both tell the child A is good and B is bad, the parents tend to have a lot of authority. But if mommy tells the child that daddy is an idiot and you shouldn't listen to daddy, and daddy says the same thing about mommy, mommy is an idiot, don't listen to her, the child is not just faced with two rival authorities. The two authorities also tend to be less authoritative. So in field diverse societies, people have developed a habitus of relative anti-authoritarianism. Finally, in terms of the intellectual habitus, Chinese people tend to think in terms of an insider-outsider epistemology. In a more field unitary regime, knowledge seems more unitary. You're confronted with this seemingly unitary landscape of knowledge. Then if some outside perspective comes in, some Westerner comments on your country, the division between insider and outsider is very sharp. So from this kind of intellectual habitus, you tend to take inside-outside categories very seriously. So Chinese people tend to think that the total insider is the one who knows. Chinese people know about China. Western people know about the West. But in a field diverse society, people have a more perspectival life experience, which leads them to think less in terms of strict insider-outsider categories, and causes that people also tend to value outsider perspectives. They're valuable too, but just in a different way. Now, this may sound a bit abstract, but you have all encountered this in your own life. You're a Chinese person. Remember, you've probably had one of those instances where you were confronted with one of those rather ignorant, arrogant foreigners who have just arrived in China, hardly spoke a word of Chinese, and yet they were commenting on everything they saw, believing that they were providing deep insights from some kind of comparative outsider perspective, whereas in fact they were fully ignorant. You would never do that. If you would go to the West, you would respect their culture, you would take your time to learn about a different culture, and you wouldn't just on your way from the airport in the taxi already start making cultural observations. Now, for the Western people in this room, many of you here are here to do research. You have a China expertise. Now, there's a fair chance that when you arrived here, you were at some point surprised that many Chinese people didn't take your research very seriously because you were an outsider. But then you were perhaps equally surprised when you later found out that you were granted massive authority on all kinds of Western topics which you thought you knew nothing about. So, perhaps going through this list of habitus elements has already given you a clue that actually the habitus that is connected to a field diverse regime is actually the habitus that is the foundation of liberal democracy. Field diversity is actually the foundation of liberal democracy. Now, if people think about liberal democracy, the first thing they tend to think of are elections, because that's what they see on the surface level. People who are more informed, they know that democracy is more. It's also about the separation of powers, the three branches of government, inclusive and transparent institutions, the notion of citizenship and the critical public sphere. Yet, behind all these lie, on a more primordial level, is field diversity. In a field diverse society where you have all these rival elites working according to irreconcilable principles, they need the public sphere as a space to negotiate. If you're a scholar official in field unitary imperial China, if you have some disagreement with some other scholar official, you can play politics or you can turn to a superior. but you never turn to the public sphere. The public sphere is there for different fields to negotiate, the representatives of different fields. Second, in a field-diverse society, society is greatly empowered vis-à-vis politics. Each of these fields forms a platform of alternative power. In a field-unitary society, politics is facing a rather unorganized society, but in a field-diverse society, society is organized. That means that politics is forced to be more responsive towards the needs of these rival elites in society. So, this also maps to the actual historical development in Europe. In Europe, you had the rise of field diversity in the 16th and 17th centuries. Then you had the rise of a critical public sphere and then democratic institutions in the 18th, 19th centuries. And then all the way at the end, in the early 20th century, you got general elections. But elections are really just the tip of the iceberg. So what are the strengths of the perspective I'm proposing? What is my perspective, our new regime theory, able to show about the world that other theoretical frameworks are not able to show? Well, I cannot systematically compare, in this short, brief presentation, my theory to all potential rival frameworks. Instead, I will pick one. The regime comparison, a recent book comparing the Chinese regime and Western liberal democratic regimes by Daniel A. Bell, Tsinghua professor in political philosophy, and just this year he published a book titled The China Model, which compared China and a Western liberal democracy. And he focused on how well these regimes were, how capable these regimes were of selecting capable leaders, capable political leaders. So he contrasts the China model with democratic elections. The China model would be the organization department of the Chinese state selecting officials to gradually reach higher office in the Chinese party state system. And of course, this is a time in which it's easy to mock elections. Now that the Republican primaries in the US are taken over by Ben Carson and Donald Trump. And in fact, Daniel Bell concludes that the Chinese model is in many ways better than the liberal democratic election model. He writes, since the early 1990s, China's political system has evolved a sophisticated and comprehensive system for selecting and promoting political talent that seems to have underpinned China's stunning economic success. Like earlier practices in imperial China, the political system aims to select and promote public servants by means of examinations and assessments of performance at lower levels of government. And he continues, if China continues to meritocratize and avoids the bad policy making stemming from voter ignorance in democratic countries, it will set a model for others. So what is different about our theoretical framework? First, we look at the relationship between politics and other fields in society. So, instead of what Daniel Bell does, is he just compares two political fields, two political systems, and he looks at their internal qualities. But especially in China, where the political field is so influential in shaping other fields across Chinese society, determining the character of the Chinese regime, certainly what we need to look at, first of all, is the external relation of the Chinese political fields to other fields in society. So second, we try to push for holistic regime comparisons. Daniel Bell isolates two elements in two different regimes. You cannot isolate these elements from the rest of the regime. Liberal democracy is not just about elections. It's also about the critical public sphere, the separation of powers. But more importantly, it's a different type of society and it's productive of a different type of human being. The same with China. You cannot, I'm sure that the whole Communist Party elite consists of highly competent people. I'm sure that's true. It's just that you cannot isolate this element when critically assessing the Chinese regime. You have to look at the structural impact the political field is making across society. The fact that some of the top leaders may be extremely capable individuals doesn't tell us anything about the structural impact of the political field on other fields in Chinese society. Thirdly, we have a different empirical emphasis. This is of course very important because theoretical frameworks are valuable to the extent that they inspire valuable empirical research. It has to direct our attention to the important developments and de-emphasize the less important developments. So for Daniel Bell, the most important developments in relating to the Chinese regime are Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign. And one of the biggest problems that the Communist Party and the Chinese state faces right now is that it doesn't have enough women in top-level party and state positions. We would argue from our theoretical framework, however, that the important developments in China are relating to field differentiation. So we would look at the professionalization, the differentiation of fields such as journalism, science, the military, and the legal field. Fourth, because Daniel Bell just looks at the internal system the Communist Party uses for promoting political talent, he finds a consistent model. His book is also titled The China Model. To an extent, perhaps the Communist Party has truly found its own model, its own formula for internally selecting capable politicians. But if you actually look at the relationship of the Communist Party to other fields in society, then the political field in China is suddenly riddled with contradictions. China is, in fact, the contemporary Chinese regime is not a model. It's not a consistent model. Rather, it's a hybrid regime in between two models. Contemporary China stands in between the old Maoist regime model, which was truly consistent. It may not have been a good model, but it was a model. And the Western liberal democratic model. And you see fragments of both regimes in contemporary China juxtaposed rather than synthesized. I will give you two examples. In the legal field and the military. In the legal field, you have a very curious juxtaposition of the Xinfang petition offices and the modern legal field. So the Xinfang petition offices are these offices to which ordinary Chinese people, for instance farmers, turn when they want to complain. For instance, about the fact that their land has been dispossessed by land developers. They complain to officers who lack a legal expertise and who do not have a legal mandate to actually help the petitioners. The Xinfang petition offices are a remnant from the Qing and Maoist China. And nowadays they're increasingly being criticized, increasingly controversial, where Chinese commentators point out that in fact this is a dysfunctional system. But of course, the Xinfang system belonged to an old model. It belonged to a model in which politics and the legal field were undifferentiated. Now at the same time, in the last few decades, we've seen the rise of a Western-style legal field in China, with prosecutors and lawyers. And the legal field has been The number of lawyers educated in China has grown exponentially over the last 30 years, and the legal field has gradually been empowered. Although the state is still sometimes worried that the legal field may be operating a bit too independent from politics. But in any case, the rise of this legal field represents the increased differentiation of politics and the legal field, of these two fields. So you see two fragments juxtaposed. They're not integrated in any meaningful way. Juxtaposed rather than synthesized, with the trend being towards further differentiation. You see the same in the military. There's still the old military, what I call the military buddy system. In the military elite, you have a dual system of military experts and political commissars. That means that for every high military official in China who has a military expertise, there is a political commissar of equal rank. They are matched, they're teamed up, they're buddies, so to speak. This was a Maoist borrowing from the Soviet Union and Qing Dynasty China. In this model, of course, politics and the military are rather undifferentiated. But at the same time, in recent years, we have seen the rise of a more professional military. Of course, if you're trying to push for a more professional military, the first thing you want to change, or diminish at least, would be this buddy system. Because how could you have a professional military if half of your higher officers do not have a military expertise, but rather only have a political expertise? So in recent years, the Chinese military has become a more professional force with its own ethos and values. And this development represents the increased differentiation of politics and the military. So the Chinese Communist Party is facing a dilemma. They have two aims: maintaining political control and modernizing China by professionalizing key social fields. But these aims are to an extent in contradiction to each other, because in order to professionalize fields such as journalism, the military, and the legal field, one of the first things that needs to be done is for the political influence to take a step back, which would lessen political control. And the party elite realizes this, and that's why they have been very hesitantly, slowly been making little steps towards increased field differentiation. Now, they may not like where this is heading, because field diversity is actually the foundation of liberal democracy. So the party elite may not like it, but every step they're making is a step towards laying the foundation for liberal democracy. Now, people who equate democracy with elections are not able to perceive this. Or people who just look at the last 10 to 20 years are not able to perceive this. But if you look at the big picture, we look at the last 200 years, the trend is towards a diminishing distance between China and Western liberal democracies. 200 years ago, you had these European colonial powers were field diverse nation states, whereas China was a field unitary empire. Then in the 20th century, China became a nation state. And now over the last 40 years, it has increasingly developed field diversity. So much of the groundwork has already been put in place. So what are the important developments when seen in China, when seen from our regime perspective? It would be Chinese professionals struggling for professional autonomy. Journalists, military officers, legal professionals who want to do their job according to their autonomous professional principles, free from political interference or other forms of interference. Of course, where China is heading is contingent upon a variety of factors, one of which is whether the political elite will allow further field differentiation to develop. That's why these are the important struggles. The important empirical phenomena to the research in China right now are relating to field differentiation. They're relating to field differentiation in the military, in the legal system, in journalism, in science. So in my presentation, I made 3 outrageously ambitious claims. The first is that we developed a new synthesized theory for understanding the fundamental power structure and character of different societies. The second is that China has a unique history of field formation, and that relative to the West, it has for hundreds, if not thousands of years, been more field unitary. Third, that field diversity is the actual foundation of liberal democracy and liberal democratic habitus, and that therefore the increased field diversification of Chinese society has partly put in place the foundation for liberal democracy. Thank you. So, questions, comments?
What would you propose as the origin of China's unique field unity in this? Would you go for geographical determinism, or do you think it's something that's much more random? So if we did it 1,000 times, this cultural aspect would turn out different each time.
Yeah, I have a great slide for this, but I'm just working with the technology here. Where is it? Excuse me. Yeah, so the curious thing about Chinese field unity is that it has such an absurdly long history. I can hardly believe it, actually, that already 2,000 years ago, China, in comparison to India, was more closed off. So in Buddhism, I'm referring to the work by Hendriks, the classical sinologist. When he studied the rise of Buddhism in Chinese society, he found that more than in India, Buddhism was confronted with this unitary opposition by the central field of scholar officials. So these scholar officials would say their principle was, under the vast heaven there is no land which is not the king's. Along the borders of the realm there is none who is not the king's subject. And it actually took 3 centuries of Buddhism adjusting to the standards of the Chinese scholar officials before it was really accepted into Chinese society. So your question, where does it come from? It's the dominance of the scholar official field throughout Chinese history, and where that comes from, I wouldn't know.
Yeah. So you say field diversity is the foundation of democracy and democratic habitus. I'm wondering if you have historical examples, more historical examples of this development, field diversity causing democracy, or the opposite, particularly, for instance, the transition of Rome from democracy to empire. Would that would logically be then, because there is more of a unitary field that created the foundation to create empire. Do you have this type of example?
Yeah. The problem is that these developments are so long term that it's hard to detect a simple causal chain, and there may not be a causal chain, because regime thinking, the kind of perspective I'm proposing, doesn't really think in terms of causal relationships, right? So a certain regime is tied to a certain type, the predominance and dominance of a certain type of human being in society, with a certain habitus. But you cannot say that, let's say, the democratic spirit of the Athenians caused the rise of democracy, or that the rise of democracy caused the democratic habitus of the Athenians. It goes together. It's a package, so to speak. And what you see is that field diverse societies have a very empowered, society forms a very empowered bloc towards politics. And in societies which turn to a political a democratic political system without having laid this foundation. Democracies are often failing. So in Africa, where the foundation was largely lacking, when they artificially introduced elections, it tended to become a mess. Because what is the worth of elections if you don't have a critical public sphere and a civil society? But how are you going to get those if you don't have an empowered society? Actually, it's really annoying. How do I slide to these? I have so many nice slides that go with this.
Sorry, again, if you don't have a critical public sphere and you said something else.
So this is, if you have, let's say this is how I imagine imperial China, right? So you would have these fragmented families, and you would have the Goliath state. And this is also how I would picture Maoist China. So if this is the situation, individuals are extremely disempowered when dealing with the state. But if you have civil society with the rise of all these fields, society is very organized vis-a-vis the state. So in such a situation, the state is forced to become more responsive to the needs of the people. Or if not the needs of the people, then at least the needs of alternative elites representing different fields in society.
During your first presentation, you were talking about how you were adjusting Bourdieu's theory. One of those things was that you differentiate between politics and bureaucracy, I think. That's what you said, right? But then when you were talking about China, you were constantly talking about politics. So I was wondering, how does the civil bureaucracy, or I don't know which term you exactly used, but how do you differentiate between politics and the bureaucracy in China, both past and present?
Well, China may actually be one of those regimes where the two are not that differentiated. To a very large extent, the state bureaucracy is a servant of the political field in China. If the top politicians, the top representatives of the Communist Party want something done, it's gonna be done, and there's no bureaucrat which can stop them. It's interesting to compare this with Scandinavian liberal democracy, where the state bureaucrats, they have their own rules, and politicians cannot just interfere in those rules. Where the state bureaucrats actually have more prestige than top-level politicians, and where they have higher salaries as well. And because they stay in office much longer, they're arguably also more powerful. So in Sweden, the state bureaucrats would operate a bit according to the yes minister principle. It's the old television series from the 80s, in which, anyway, so bureaucracy is not always a servant of politics. It can even be the dominant field, but it's certainly not the dominant field in China. And China is one of those regimes where politics is truly the dominant field.
Just very quickly, in the United States, would you say that bureaucracy serves the political field?
Well, you have a fairly differentiated bureaucratic field in the US as well. Yeah, in the US, I would argue the business field is the leading field, right? So both the state bureaucracy and politics would be heteronomized to a great extent by the influence of business.
I think to make your theory more falsifiable, it would really help to bring up very difficult cases, particularly with your thesis about how professionalization of fields presents a threat to state power, and because I just kept thinking of examples in numerous fields where when China had a choice between allowing professionalization to flourish, and I do think Chinese people want to professionalize. I think there's definitely toward that, allowing people to professionalize, whether it's maintaining control. They chose control.
Yeah.
I can think of in the military, and in particular particularly important moment in political history where the government decided to, when they saw defections in the military, to recruit people from the countryside who were probably less professional, I presume. A human rights lawyer who had an excellent defense from two very professional lawyers, but still, didn't win his case.
Yeah.
An environmental journalist in the field of journalism who published a brilliant documentary raising concerns about pollution in China that again was censored.
Yeah.
And even a businessman in a joint venture in Sichuan, very professional, but was put in prison. So yeah, it seems like I kept thinking of counterexamples that challenge the theory.
Well, there are certainly many counter trends, and history is the future is open. I'm not saying China will by necessity go towards further professionalization of different social fields. And then whenever you look at the struggles for autonomy of different fields, it's usually a contradictory tale, right? It will go forward and it will go backwards. It's very complex, and it also depends on which field you look at. The legal field has been gaining in autonomy in the last 30 years, whereas perhaps science hasn't. So you're right to point this out. It's not actually. I was just looking at the big picture, the big trend of the last 50 years, right?
Well, what would be
So-
some positive cases of that professionalization trumping control?
Well, the legal field, for instance, like what you mentioned cases where human rights lawyers are jailed, for instance, right? That of course happens, but the big picture is still that you have much more lawyers nowadays than you had 30 years ago in China. They introduced a new common law only a decade ago. So the big trend of the last 30 years has been towards the increased differentiation and professionalization of the legal field. But of course, you're right that there's a whole mass of counter examples where the state interfered and exerted direct political control. So this is also why I called it a dilemma, because the Communist Party is not really comfortable fully pushing China steadily pushing towards increased field differentiation, because field differentiation entails the political field having less unifying power. So my theory is not like I was laying out a theory, and then in addition I was observing certain trends in Chinese society, but I'm certainly not proposing a kind of teleological framework in which societies are moving towards a necessary end goal. That would be the kind of Fukuyama end of history kind of framework. That's not what I'm proposing.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hendriks, for your wonderful speech. I would like to have a question regarding the fundamental aspect of variables. The second variable you've mentioned is called the power relations between fields, which I see as a very big variable, perhaps a group of several sub-variables. So my question is, to what depth do you seek to explore these different kinds of relations, and how would you evaluate the weights of these different kinds of relations? And third, I saw some graphs as you scrolled down through the hidden slides that you prepared. Could you also elaborate on some of the numerical evidence that might support your theory? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. This is a general theoretical framework, a general perspective of making sense of things in society, right? Numerical evidence. Well, for instance, the exponential growth of lawyers over the last 40 years, which I mentioned before. But I think what you really want to know is how are we going to analyze what the power relations between these fields are, right? So, okay, what are the power relations between the fields? How are we going to detect this? Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. These slides are confusing me. I'm used to. I'm used to just being able to scroll through them. I have a slide on this. Yes. Yes. So I have the theory of the 5 reproduce for this. I gave it a Chinese Communist Party style name just for fun. So, if you want to detect what the power relations between fields in a certain society, in a certain regime are, you have to look at how they're differentiated. You have to look at their possession of what I argue are the 5 fundamental sources of power in society. I argue that every society there are 5 fundamental sources of power. The first is the means of coercive violence. The second would be control over wealth distribution. The third would be public voice, whose voice is being heard. Fourth, the power to write the laws and set the rituals. The fifth, control over education and what is deemed legitimate knowledge. So for instance, for the first, right, the means of coercive violence. Who owns the means of coercive violence? And if it's not a total monopoly, who shares the ownership over the means of coercive violence? Is there a nation state where the political field has turned the military into a servant? Does the state have the means over coercive violence? Wealth. Who has the most money? You look at a society, what are the power relations between fields? Who is the richest? Do you have a clerical elite, which is filthy rich? Or do you have a business elite, which is filthy rich? Or are politicians extremely rich? Or are their families all getting rich? Third, public voice. Who speaks in public? Whose voice? And in the modern societies, that would be who monopolizes the media, right? Which voices are most prominent in the media? But even in a primitive tribal society, some groups' perspective will be more loudly voiced, more publicly voiced than that of other groups. The fourth, the power to write the laws. You can write the laws. By writing the laws, you can consolidate your power in society by creating laws that are in the long-term interest of your power position. So, in the United States, for instance, you recently had the Supreme Court ruling that businesses are people as well. Businesses also have human rights. Businesses also have freedom of speech, which was clearly a court ruling in the advantage of the business field. So, determining what is law writing is not just determined by politicians or legal experts. You also have religious law, and you also have you can also have the business field influencing the legal system, what laws are being written. So looking at who's actually writing the laws and in whose interest are the laws gives you a clue to what the power relations between fields are. If you have a theocracy, of course the clerical elite is going to have a huge influence on the character of the law. Now I wrote there / the rituals. This is because in many societies rituals and the law are not clearly distinct. Rituals create symbolic boundaries, let's say between the holy and the profane. So symbolic boundaries which entail hierarchical distinctions. The dominant set of rituals in a society and the symbolic hierarchies they draw, in whose interest are they being drawn? So you look at the law and you look at the rituals in a society. This could be perhaps best done by ethnographic fieldwork. And then you look at who controls the education curricula. And education is such a powerful, it's such a source of power, because if you have control over education, you can mold the next generation in your image. Plus, you can set the standards for what is deemed legitimate knowledge. So, actually all fields, in major fields in society, offer forms of education. The business field has education, training for employees. The religious field offers religious education. The political field offers different forms of political education. Then you have the state bureaucracy, which in modern societies, of course, are the foundation of much of the education system. So if you look at these five if you systematically look at these 5 sources or sites of power, and you look at who controls them, to what extent, and to what extent are the players that control them differentiated from each other. That will also teach you about the differentiation of the different fields.
Yeah, thank you for the trade-offs that occur between the center and the periphery. And you certainly talk about the contradictions among the different interest groups, but I think this one factor deserves extra weight. And I was wondering how that applies to China, obviously from its imperial history up to the present, and what you see the future of center-peripheral relations in China and how it's present in your theory.
Yeah, a great question, because that is indeed something I didn't discuss in my presentation. The centralization, the scale on which fields manifest themselves. So you could have regimes, nation-state regimes. You have fields predominantly institutionalized on the national level. But of course, in feudal empires, fields would be more localized. And China is a very interesting case, because China had, for a very long time, a very centralized structure. But Imperial China had a very curious characteristic. If I can find it, which was spelled out by Fei Xiaotong, the famous Chinese sociologist. So, if this would be the central field of the scholar officials in China, we'd have the emperor on the top. And the way of direction, the orders were going straight down. The emperor or top leading scholar officials would send orders down to be implemented on the local level. And then at the local level, these orders would end up at the yamen. But you also had the local gentry, which were, I would argue, part of the central field of scholar officials, because they had the same principles, the same conception of human accomplishment. But in terms of organization, there was a fundamental rupture. Because instead of the command structure going all the way from the top to the bottom, the local units were actually rather independent. So the yamen, so the lowest level of the central command structure, would give the order, instead of directly to the local unit, would give it to the Shangyao. And the Shangyao would then negotiate with the local gentry, and the local gentry could then refuse the order. This was a very ingenious way of managing the fact that you couldn't disobey an order by the Chinese emperor. You would have a death penalty for disobeying an order by the Chinese emperor. But, of course, Chinese emperors were often making up policies which are completely impossible to implement. Or the local gentry at least didn't want to implement it. So then instead of openly having to shame the emperor by ignoring his orders, the order would go to a third party who would then communicate with the local gentry. And the local gentry would then only disrespect or ignore the Shangyao without openly refusing the order by the central structure. So what you see here is that Imperial China was actually highly centralized. It had an enormous central machinery. But as Fei Xiaotong wrote, we somehow managed to hang up the centralized power so that it did not reach to the ground. But then with the transition to Maoist communism, the orders did go all the way to the ground. And that's where the social structure becomes total. So this is why Imperial China, even though it was field unitary, you had one dominant field, there was still quite some diversity quite some autonomy on the local level. But that autonomy was not a separate field autonomy. The local gentry was not playing according to the rules of another field. It's just they were in the same field. It's just the organizational structure was broken. So yeah, this I find this absolutely fascinating. But I'm not sure if I truly answered every part of your question
How
there.
does that relate to contemporary China? Take that into the present, please.
Well, contemporary China has a very different structure. First of all, because the arrow does go all the way down now, but you have the rise of a number of semi-autonomous fields. So on the one hand, China has become more diverse. On the other hand, it's become more total in the sense that orders do go all the way from the top to the ground. Yeah, so it's a bit diversified on the level of fields, but it's become more unitary perhaps in terms of the organizational structure of the central field.
Yeah, I got a couple of questions. Actually, in China that you're talking about, I think there's some kind of historical diversity in Chinese history. When you're talking about Chinese different dynasties, during the Ming Dynasty, I think the system that you're talking about right here is probably right. But before the imperial examination system has been set up, you have different families working around, powerful families working with Chinese emperors. Some of related to Chinese emperors, some are not. So I think how we deal with the historical diversity of Chinese political system. Secondly, I think when we come to today's China, there's a very important reform in 1994, the fiscal reform, which gave strong powers, strong controls to local authorities. And some of the French fiscal, Pierre Bourdieu, qualified this Chinese system as major corporatism, which means that local government has much more power when they're dealing with central government. So it's kind of, basically the question is diversity. How do you deal with use theory about the historical diversity and systematic diversity of society?
Yeah. So the first issue you raised about the different dynasties having a different character. Of course, I was speaking in my presentation very generally about the general trait of imperial China. But of course, during the Ming and the Qing, the exam system was much more consolidated than before that. And there were times when, early on, there was no solid, consolidated exam system. But even if you look at the works of Erik Zürcher, this field's unitary structure, the dominance of the central field of scholars officials, goes back a very long time, at least 2,000 years. So that means that there has been many changes in Chinese history on many different levels, but there is a shocking level of continuity, which absolutely baffles me. And the second issue raised about the local within contemporary China, you were talking about contemporary China, the local level being relatively empowered versus the national level. I must admit that I don't know much about. I know virtually nothing about that. It's just that is not field diversity, right? If the empowerment of the local officials versus the national level officials, that's relating to the inner organization of a field. But all local officials and national officials are all players in the same field. They're just in different positions within the same field. So if I would apply Pierre Bourdieu, I would put them in the same. I would put them in the same field.
Do you think? Thank you for the presentation. Do you think the diversity of views are necessarily better than the unitary force, or is it more important, especially in the era of globalization? Because back in the ancient Greeks, I believe many Greeks, they saw the Sparta as a more effective government structure.
Yeah, that's the big question, of course. They have weaknesses. They have pros and cons. Diverse societies are more creative, more porous, and more open. But that is also their weakness, because they lack unity, right? So there's a trade-off there. Nowadays, when scholars write about the 17th century Dutch Republic, they praise the diversity of Dutch society. But during that time, many foreigners thought it was an absolute mess. And nowadays, when we write about China, in the Qing dynasty China, we see it as a failure compared to Western Europe and the United States, which developed quicker in many ways. But during that time, especially in the 17th century, Westerners who came to China were absolutely baffled by this enormous, majestic empire. So what the principles are, what our standard of judgment should be. It's a very complicated normative question. And certainly I would tend to side with field diversity. But there are also serious drawbacks to it. Oh yeah, and as you mentioned, indeed, we nowadays tend to praise democratic Athens, but many of the major philosophers of ancient Athens disliked the democratic habitus they saw around them. You would have all these ignorant young kids running around with their own opinion, voicing their opinion on all kinds of matters they know hardly anything about, and they were narcissistic. And they couldn't stick. They would have all tons of hobbies. They couldn't stick to one activity in life. This is democratic, the free-wielding democratic spirit, which we nowadays perhaps associate with Americans, right? Many of those traits were actually associated with ancient Athens at one point. And indeed, then they wrote about Sparta, often in a very admiring way. So their own society was at war with Sparta, or had just been at war with Sparta, and an enormous proportion of the Athenian population had been slaughtered in that war. And still, you had the Athenian philosophers, such as Aristotle, writing with admiration of the Spartan regime. Yeah.
I was wondering you would fit the period of the Verzuiling, which is typically Dutch, I think, into this system.
Sorry, one more time?
How you would fit the period of the Verzuiling in Holland?
Oh, the Verzuiling.
Into the system.
The pillarized society. So, the pillarized society was in the Netherlands in the early 20th century. You had people from different ideological groups which tended to stick together and didn't want to interact with outsiders. So you had the Protestant group, you had the Catholic group, you had the liberal group, and you had the socialist group. And if you were a socialist, you were part of the Social Democratic Party or the Socialist Party, you would go to socialist clubs, you would socialize with other socialists. And a Protestant would not go to a Catholic bakery store. The Catholic would not go to a Protestant bakery store. Well, that is actually what tolerance is all about. It's a deep disrespect for different groups, and yet somehow managing to live together, which is what every field and field diverse society and ethnically diverse society and religiously diverse society has to deal with. Yeah. Yeah. So this is definitely something you would never had really in China. When the first Buddhists came to China and they started building their own monastic orders, that was really looked at with great suspicion. Because they were creating an alternative power structure, which was not accepted. So that would be one of the central characteristics of the Dutch regime, of Dutch history, and of Western European history more generally, that we had immensely diverse societies. And nowadays in the United States, you have also, in addition to field diversity, you also have massive ethnic diversity, right? So it is hard for people who come from a very field unitary society such as China to truly understand how diverse a country such as the Netherlands or the United States is. But people who come from these highly diverse regimes have difficulties understanding just how unitary China used to be and how unitary China still is to a large extent. So you would have these Western young entrepreneurs, they're 21, they just finished their business school, and they travel here to Beijing to start their own company in China because they want to be the next Jack Ma. And they drink coffee in the Starbucks at Chongguancun, And then after a while, nothing gets going, and then they leave again. They come here thinking that without really speaking Chinese, without knowing anyone, without having political connections, they can become the next Jack Ma. But this is actually possible in a country like the United States. You can go to the United States and you have a good business idea. You can actually become a major businessman in the US. It's just that China is much more closed. You cannot, as an outsider, step in and have that kind of success. So that's why this is what you have. Everyone carries their own regime bias, and we're constantly projecting our own regime onto other countries in the world. And there are many examples of this. Perhaps we should round up because it's already pretty late. Oh, one more question?
Okay, and thank you for the presentation. It's a second time I've heard theory. Last time is in Peking University giving by Mike. And last time he talked about a slogan called Kill the Culture. And I examined in your presentation, you left no space for culture, especially Chinese culture.
Yes.
To understand Chinese system.
Yes, I do.
Yeah, there is a very strong voice in modern China to understand Chinese history using the culture as an important factor.
Yeah.
Yeah, could you please give us some explanation to your black?
Yes. Well, thank you for pointing this out, because I've been deliberately ignoring the word culture, right? The regime perspective believes that societies have holistic character, which is political / social / cultural / economic. And that these divisions between that thinking of culture, I mean, there's not necessarily something wrong with culture, but usually when people think of culture, they think of it as something that's hanging up in the sky, disconnected from social structure, disconnected from the power relations. So I deliberately try to make a rhetorical break with the culture concepts by trying to use it as little as possible. So I love to talk about regimes and regimes habitus, but sometimes, of course, when I'm having a daily conversation, I also slip into using the word culture. Anyway, thank you all for coming. It was a pleasure. And we feel really honored that all of you showed up. And